Hello, everyone, and we are back once again for a brand new episode of House, the Shared Living Podcast. This is episode 2 in season 6. We'll be with you for the next few months to bring you the latest news, views, and insights from the rented shared living sector. So, if you work in and around PBSA, BTR, co-living, university accommodation, HMO, and rented later living sectors, you are in the right place. I'm Dan Smith from Resi Consultancy and VerbaFlow AI.
I'm Sarah Canning from the Property Marketing Strategist.
And I'm Deenie Lee from the Property Marketing Strategist.
And now let's hear from our headline sponsor, My Student Halls.
Housed is sponsored by Spotlight Boost on mystudenthalls.com. Use Spotlight Boost to stand out in search results and drive more leads to your properties.
We're delighted Dan and the team from My Student Halls have decided to be our headline sponsors once again. They are such a key part of the student accommodation marketing cycle. Great partners to us at House. They've been with us from the start. So thanks very much to Dan and the team at My Student Halls. Do go and get your properties listed with them. Also, a huge thank you to Wash Station, Utopia and Howden. More from them later. So today we are doing one of our favourite things, following up on our look back at some of our predictions from 2025. We are now looking forward in 2026. So we're going to be looking ahead. We're recording this at a moment where shared living feels very much like it's on the edge of some pretty significant change in terms of regulation, affordability, demographics, higher education, aging, AI. It's all colliding. So today we're going to share our predictions for the year ahead across 5 key sectors. That's PBSA, sort of student housing, build to rent, co-living, university accommodation, and rented later living. So we'll try to be as honest as we possibly can, not optimistic for the sake of it, and certainly not doom-laden either. We're really keen to make sure that there is some positive realism in every sector at the moment. And I think we're probably best off starting with PBSA first of all, because this is where a lot of those shared living conversations still begin for all of us. So, I mean, 2025 was a pretty challenging year for PBSA as a whole. And, there was no area of the PBSA sector that was untouched by occupancy challenges in particular, and certainly no city as well. And when you look at the StuRents data, it was roughly 6% behind year on year in terms of the occupancy for various different reasons. And that includes, the growth of the shadow market, as we're calling it, in BTR and co-living, but also I think lots of issues around the likes of affordability. Now, what I can see is that PBSA is probably going to become more polarized. So I think the best schemes will perform very well, as long as those pricing expectations are realistic, if they've got strong locations around good universities with flexible offers. But the middle ground is going to feel very squeezed. I also think there's going to be a challenge with those investors that were looking for the short-term gains or the short-term holds compared to those that are very focused on the long-term and more of an income play. I think that is a very safe bet. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that, Deenie?
I have a hope that this is the year that PBSA realise that it's time to change and innovate. I think, as you say, Dan, it was a different year again for PBSA, more difficult for some than others. And I think people are realising that we've got to change. But as you know, I still have a worry that the sector is quite slow to make that change. But I think I want to see change and I want to see innovation, but I think it's unlikely we're going to see much material difference this year. But I'm hoping that there's going to be more planning going forward and more testing and more ways that people are kind of trying to see if there's different ways we can go with the market, some more testing on flexible rooms, those kinds of things.
I think one thing that was really interesting about that is a post I put out on LinkedIn following up on a BBC article this weekend got quite a lot of traction actually for a Sunday, which meant I was quite busy. But that was basically saying that, we need more flexibility in the models that we're putting forward, because commuter students are increasing quite drastically, and for good reason, that students can no longer afford, in a lot of cases, to go to university because that cost of living is so high. What was really good to see is that a lot of the comments on that LinkedIn post were from people saying, we've tried this and we're now looking at this, and a lot of universities were then saying to me on WhatsApp or on LinkedIn, we're doing this. Like, we are offering more facilities like showers and communal spaces and co-working spaces for commuter students, because we've seen that they really need it. We're also offering, 1 night, 2 night stays at really reasonable prices. And I know that we talked about it over the weekend as well, and that you've seen people offering that too. And I think one of the key issues that we have from that is that it's very difficult to make the numbers stack up. I had several people say to me, like, it's not easy to make the numbers stack up on those nightly rates if you can make them affordable. It can't just be £100 a night. It has to be much more akin to sort of 20, maybe £50 a night if you're lucky, so that you could go to a ball, you could go to an event, you could do a late night and early morning lecture if you really need to. And I think with the more voids that we see in university halls, but also in PBSA, that is going to become more something that we hopefully have to talk about more.
And I think that is the struggle that we have, is that it is difficult to make those numbers stack up. And I think the narrative's still very much in the PBSA world. It's not possible. Let's not think about it. Whereas, as you say, I think universities have more leeway and more of a purpose in providing that to support those commuting students, which is why, I'd love this to be a prediction, but I don't think it's going to happen. But I think this is why we need to see innovation from the ground up. This isn't about small tweaks we need in PBSA. This is about a complete change of how we operate, how we run, and how we build, and how we renovate. Maybe more apt as opposed to building. But I still don't think there's anyone brave enough in the sector to do it, unfortunately, which is why I don't think it's a prediction. But if you are brave enough, I'd love to touch you.
I think that's where I'm a bit conflicted with this episode, to be honest, is I was trying to work out what is the difference between a prediction and a hope. And I'm not sure I've nailed it, but I think based on what you just said, Deenie, I mean, I'm seeing a lot of PBSA being given planning permission. There's announcements all the time, which does worry me, because what is being given permission for? Because if it's the same as what's always been given permission for, it's going to be very, very sticky. They're going to struggle to fill based on a model that has gone before. So that worries me, because I feel like all of those underwrites need to be re-underwritten, because I don't think that whatever they put into the spreadsheet effectively probably 2-3 years ago is going to be the right model anymore. Everything has changed in that 3 years, from international students to the way that courses are being run, to commuting students. So again, I don't know if this is so much of a prediction, but a plea to review in 2026, really, that things need to change. What I do know, and it's less of a prediction because several operators have told us they're looking into it, but they are looking into flexible stays, pricing ladders, more twin rooms. We did say that after Property Week in December, there was a lot more yes people. There were a lot more people saying, yes, we're going to try and do it. We haven't seen the evidence in very many places. We have seen a few isolated operators trying different things with their void rooms. But again, universities, I think, are taking a different view on trying some of these things, because they're probably less bound to be making commercial decisions about having co-working spaces or having shower rooms or putting lockers in for commuting students. I don't think any of those things can't be done by PBSA, if I'm honest. I don't think that PBSA should have empty beds and do nothing with them. I think the social spaces are underutilised during the week, during the daytimes, and could be welcomed for commuting students. There is something that can be done there, but I don't know how it can be monetised, or does it have to be monetised so much? Or if you've got really great CSR and ESG policies, can it not just form part of just doing a really, really good thing?
So is this the year where we actually focus on what students really want? I think there's a lot of lip service that's traditionally paid to that by the PBSA sector in particular. I think universities have got a big opportunity to actually refocus on what students really want. And that is students who want to commute. Some just want to commute. That's absolutely fine. Some of them actually can't afford to live on campus or off campus and have to commute. So is this the year where we actually see universities really refocus on those students that, and supporting those students. Now, they aren't as commercial as PBSA needs to be because they don't have to worry as much about investor returns, of course, as an element of financial viability, of course, around every university that they're struggling with at the moment. But I think that's where universities have got a real opportunity to say, look, what students want is changing quite drastically, not just in an era of AI, but in an era of affordability. And I think there was talk of 2-year degrees and what that might do, more apprenticeship degrees. Universities really have to start making some pretty drastic changes in order to stay relevant. And I think PBSA also has to by proxy. So I think there will need to be a lot more flexibility. I think there will need to be more affordability within the sector. I mean, that goes without saying. It's pretty obvious. But you have to then refocus that on value. It shouldn't just be like all PBSA need to be offering cheap rooms. I don't like the term cheap. It was Steve from Kexkill who actually refrained from saying cheap rooms that University Quarters and Kexkill were offering. It's great value rooms. And I think that's what we need to get back to in PBSA in particular, to really focus on that value for all students. And what they're going to want, in my opinion, and from seeing the studies and seeing where the numbers are going, is more affordability and more flexibility. So if we actually do offer them that, the issue that we have is that the likelihood will be that there will be diminishing investor returns, less revenue, and obviously less of a return in the long term for those investors. I can't see a way where you could maximize your revenue but offer maximum flexibility, because everybody knows that they can offer short stays with various different short stay providers, and it doesn't necessarily. It may help. It may be a marginal gain. It may give you the extra sort of 2 to 5%. Who knows? Maybe that will be enough. But realistically, how do we make sure that we're giving students what they want, but that we're also then showcasing to investors that they can, still get good returns whilst offering more flexibility? I'm not sure you can right now. So yeah, it's a tricky one. So flexibility will probably become mainstream. That's kind of what we hope anyway. But how about the marketing side of things? Sarah and Deenie, what are your predictions on that? Are we going to see more PBSA focus on amenities, or are we going to see them switch more to affordability and flexibility and actually thinking about those students?
I think what we've seen at the kickoff of this leasing season is still very much offer-led, and that's disappointing to see. And it's not the marketeers' fault. We know it's because there's so much pressure on, from the investors, from finance, from everything. Make sure that you put this offer out, that offer out, and that's not helping. We discussed that in our Christmas episode, that it's really hard for students to understand what the value is of the proposition when all they can see are discounts and offers. I don't think it's a prediction that that's going to change. Hopefully it is, but I don't know if the marketing departments are strong enough to kind of hold their own when they're being pressurized in so many ways by advertising special offers. We're not seeing enough research or training going on. That's kind of a massive plug for the property marketing strategist, but with good intentions, and it doesn't have to be with us, but we would just like to see more investment being made into the marketing departments, but also with training. We always say that marketeers are only delivering leads. They're not the ones responsible for converting the sales. And that's really, really hard. We've kicked off the year with a training session, and, our training sessions are changing because the objections that students will have are changing, and the teams need to be geared up for all of that because it's so competitive. You want your strongest team in place to be dealing with all of those leads and converting the sales.
I think it's about time you started plugging some of your services, by the way, guys. But I think that I would love this to be the year that we cancel the cashback. But unfortunately, I think it's the year that investors in particular have again got their pricing wrong in certain locations and for certain assets from the start. Because the ideal is that you have a best price guarantee for your rebookers, so they know that they're not going to get undersold a bit later on, and people who book in August will get a cheaper room than anyone who booked earlier. And I can see the cashbacks already. Any cashback over 250 quid means that you've got your pricing wrong from the start. Why we are not putting our rents out at reasonable rates and then hopefully, pushing those prices and yielding those prices through the year, I just don't know. And I think it's investor-led. I don't think it's operator-led. I think it's investors demanding that, those returns are still on the table when they aren't. And that is going to be one of the major problems. I speak to various different investors, and I've got various investor clients. Luckily, I have very good investor clients who are very amenable and genuinely listen to the operators. But I know of plenty who have come to me and said, we bought within the last 2 to 3 years and these returns aren't what we thought they would be. The income is not there. The occupancy isn't there quite as much as we thought. Like, don't get me wrong, the income play is still very good for PBSA, but some of these underwrites post-COVID were wildly unrealistic. And that's what we're now dealing with. And I think this is probably the year when last year was really when that got found out. I think that was 2025 was the year when a lot of investors went, hang on a minute, this is actually pretty hard. Occupancy's dipped by nearly 6%. Our revenue isn't there. We're having to do more cashbacks. It is a lot tougher out there, without a doubt. And that's where people accuse me of being bearish. Well, the market is bearing that out. Like Stu Rents to come out and say, yeah, occupancy is 6% behind year on year. Like that is obvious. So I think this is probably the year where we are still going to see a lot of late cashbacks, a lot of marketplace, a lot of revenue going to marketplaces. And what we need to do is just totally recalibrate how we do the rents. You will need to recalibrate.
I agree. I would love it to be the year we don't see cashbacks anymore, but I don't think it is. I think we're still going to see a lot of cashbacks going in. But I did just want to kind of make a bit of a prediction about kind of where I guess government and universities might go, which is going to impact PBSA. And I know we need to move on to other sectors, but I do think that we are going to see a push from the government and young people around probably more practical degrees and apprenticeships, because I think there's news already about young graduate recruitment is struggling. Graduates are struggling to find jobs. And I think we're then going to see a push for the government from going down degree levels or more practical education that isn't going to be impacted by AI, jobs that aren't going to be impacted by AI. And I think that is something the PBSA sector needs to be prepared for and adjust to. And I think we need to get our ducks in a row and start talking about how we can make sure that apprentices are seen as part-time students, not part-time workers. And that's a real challenge for the sector, but they should be seen as part-time students, especially if that's the way that we're going to get a push to get people into education and get them employed.
That will require PBSA to have a change in use, because at the moment they can only take full-time students anyway. But you're right, there's a warning there that everybody listening should look into that and see what they can do to attract part-time students as well. And that just goes hand in hand with the flexibility that we've been talking about. Those part-time students may not need full-time accommodation, but from what we know about apprenticeships is they're very much focused on the major cities, which might result in migration of young people that have to move to cities to do their apprenticeships, but maybe they want to go to their hometowns at the weekend. Maybe full-time students do as well and don't want to pay for those extra 2-3 days over a weekend. So yeah, I think there's a lot to do and unpick with flexibility. I probably can speak on behalf of the three of us hosts here that we'd love to be involved in those conversations. We'd love to, help support operators and investors and developers in kind of problem solving and trying to work through some of those ideas and recommendations. I don't know if all of this is more of a hope than a prediction.
Well, we're going to have to talk about it. Because universities are having to think about it, because the graduate outcomes are slipping. Like less students are able to get into employment. And that's partly due to AI, but it's partly just due to the economy and the way that degrees are set up. I don't think universities are remotely set up to generate success for any graduate at the moment, to be completely honest. In an era of AI, when you start your degree in let's say, graphic design, and then 3 months later realize that the whole thing that you were set up, the whole career you were set up to do has been almost replaced by AI, and you need to change to be able to use AI rather than just generate the graphics with or design with various bits of software. It's totally changing the way that the world of work operates, and I don't think universities are setting up students particularly well for it so far. And as a result, I think there will be some decision paralysis, certainly from postgrads. We've seen that. There was, a 15 to 20% drop off in postgraduate numbers last year. I mean, that's pretty catastrophic. That's not even factoring in the fact that the government banning the dependent visas. Like that is just the fact that students are not necessarily studying postgraduate degrees, which were an absolute cash cow for universities. So I think we almost need a reinvention. It feels like it's business as usual for a lot of places, but we'll come on to university halls in a minute, but it's just universities need almost complete reinvention in some way, shape or form. And I think that PBSA needs to become, and university halls, of course, accommodation needs to become a big part of that. But those degree apprenticeships are absolutely pivotal because they will focus students and those apprentices on the actual outcome. I'm not sure that it's going to be okay to just go and study French and politics anymore and expect to then walk into a degree in the civil service. I think you're going to need to be a lot more targeted about what you start studying and what you know you're going to walk into when you finish. And that's where degree apprenticeships really come in. You get paid as you go as well, but they are gold dust. How do you broaden them? How do you broaden the appeal? How do you make more people understand what they are? We need some serious apprenticeship champions. And Deenie, I know you've got great experience with that, and that is definitely something that we think is going to be part of the future. But what the hell does that then look like for PBSA? I think that's going to be really interesting. You're going to need Steve Reed and the entire planning department to sort of step forward and say, yeah, okay, cool. You can, you don't just have to be limited to students. You can take apprentices. You can take various others too, because that will level the playing field as well between co-living, BTR, and PBSA too.
But we need to be taking control of our destiny in that, and we're not. We need to be speaking to the government about it now and see it coming. But maybe that will happen. It's not hope. We'll see.
I agree. And we're at risk of spending the whole time. And to be fair, we actually probably could break this out into talking about each sector per episode, but we will need to move on. But lastly, I do think this is the year that we start talking about 2030 and the demographic dip. Not to be a doom monger too much, but between 2030 and 2040, the number of 18-year-olds even eligible to go to university will drop by around 20%. That is a significant drop off. And it is extremely concerning when it seems to be that domestic students are, what is almost saving the day at the moment for some PBSA operators. The international numbers will probably remain volatile, I would say, depending on geopolitical factors and affordability pressures. We've seen a drop off in Indian students, Chinese students, undergrads look okay. Postgrad numbers are down. So yeah, we are going to need to start thinking about what PBSA looks like beyond 2030, and whether we're still building the right stock. 47% of the stock that we're building is studio stock. Is that because it's what students want? I would question that. I would say it's what makes the numbers stack up, which really sets us up as a house of cards with everything to come crashing down. And that all being said, within PBSA, there are some serious opportunities out there to really, use those tailwinds, because there are some tailwinds out there to not necessarily generate the returns of old. I think they've gone. I think we need to really be focused on the fact that we're a mature sector and we're looking for long-term institutional capital with steady returns. And I think that's where any investor aligned with that is going to do very well in the right locations, focusing on Russell Group in particular, because tier 2 and tier 3 universities are really going to struggle for numbers and from a financial viability perspective. But there are still some opportunities out there, both in building and acquiring assets. So whilst we have sort of focused on a lot of headwinds, I think that is, an opportunity. There are plenty of opportunities out there. Anyway, let's now hear from Utopia.
Utopia is the trusted partner for high-performance asset management.
cutting energy costs, reducing risk, and delivering proven ESG results.
With billions of data points and 75,000 rooms monitored, Utopia turns real-time intelligence into measurable value, protecting investments and driving continuous improvement.
Choose intelligence that delivers. Choose Utopia. Thanks very much to the team at Utopia. They have been with us for quite a few seasons now, and we see them everywhere, and for good reason. They are delivering excellent value across the board for shared living operators. So do get in touch with them with anything with regards to energy management and the data behind it and how to control it. Utopia are the people to get in touch with. So thanks very much to the team there for sponsoring. So now on to BTR, build to rents. And this feels like a sector that everyone is quietly watching. I think it's roughly at about 150,000 beds, including the pipeline where the spades are in the ground. It's been an interesting year for BTR, I think, because it feels like it's maturing. And by that, I mean, we've talked at length about the fact that there are a lot of students living in BTR. And I think the narrative is starting to switch to, yes, there is an acceptance that students are living in BTR, and they choose it for good reason because they like the flexibility, the amenities, not necessarily living with loads of other students. I would still say that probably around 30% from some of the stats that we've seen from Price Hubble, 30% of BTR is taken up by students on a nationwide basis. And we've seen that, from the Price Hubble stats. But it does feel like there is much more maturity in that, 2 years, maybe 3 years post completion for these BTR projects that are relatively new, you're seeing less and less students living there. Now, that's not across the board, but that was just taken from the Verve Life and Harris Associates study that we saw the other day. It was a good report, and it was just explaining that, BTR is maturing. It does take less students in year 2 and year 3 because it is curating that community of young professionals. So I think that is quite an interesting one. But yeah, Deenie, what are your thoughts on BTR? Are you positive about it?
I think I'm relatively positive about BTR. I think it's in an interesting position. We already know the students are living in it. With the Renters' Right Act coming in this year for definite, I think it gives it a good ground because it can offer that flexibility that HMOs can, that PBSA won't be able to through its exemption or won't through its exemption. So it kind of sits in a good kind of middle ground where students trust it, and it can take non-students and everyone and give a degree of flexibility. But I still think that there is a risk of BTR that it needs to look at that product diversity. I think we're still building for one type of customer at kind of one type of price range, and that isn't what we need from a housing perspective. Again, not sure we're going to see much changing that this year at all. But I think it's something that the sector needs to start thinking about because we need a range of budgets, not just one product for one part of the sector.
Yeah, I think my thoughts are pretty similar. Although if I take what we heard at UK Reef in 2025, there was starting to be some indication that BTR developments are kind of losing some of their heavy amenitized sites, and it's like they're learning, I guess, as any new sector does, about what's working, what's not working, what the customer is looking for. And if some of those kind of very highly amenitized sites are kind of looking at efficiencies, maybe in turn that will see the prices sort of come down, or kind of, I don't know, more BTR light type developments. I hate that phrase, by the way, but those kind of, I guess efficient accommodation that is just purely managed rental living without all of the bells and whistles. So I think on the basis that we heard about it in 2025, I think we will start to see some of those developments come through in 2026. I mean, and I've written notes on this based on one of our other sections on this podcast, but I'll talk about it now from a marketing point of view. Like Deenie said, everybody can live in BTR. So it's only because it's been marketed to one type of renter, which is really that kind of young professional earning quite a lot of money kind of sector. But actually, families can live in it, older people can live in it, students can live in it. And, we know that they've not necessarily been marketed to, but they found it anyway. So there is a market for a more diverse tenant. And I'd like to see the marketing kind of vary on that, really. BTR hasn't needed to try very hard with marketing. They've chosen really, really great locations where there's a need for housing. So kind of previously that hasn't actually been been worth talking about. But maybe it will get tougher if those prices keep going up. It's going to be tougher to fill those beds. And I think, we are seeing a lot of development stalling. There's not as many coming through as there have been in previous years. Is this deliberate? That actually, developers are seeing a bit of a kind of, downturn, I guess, in renting at those levels, and they're holding off, or is it a problem with planning? I don't know what the answer is to that, but hopefully BTR will continue to thrive and we will see more of those developments coming through with a bit more focus on segmentation of who it's for. It can't be for everybody anymore. It needs to be a bit more purposeful in the local market, in the target audience, etc.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think students being in BTR has always been seen as a dirty little secret, and it shouldn't be. They're choosing BTR for good reason, because it is offering flexibility and, in a lot of cases, affordability for the space that you get. Would you prefer a box room or would you prefer a one-bed apartment? I think this is where the difference between PBSA and BTR is borne out. And PBSA, it used to be that, well, hey, why would you live anywhere else when PBSA is so focused on student and that pastoral care and support? And actually what we've found is that there are some students that actually don't necessarily want that. They want to be living with young professionals. They want to be almost treated like grown-ups. I don't mean that condescendingly to PBSA, but I think there is a real focus on really getting that life experience, and that's where BTR can certainly come in. So I think that hopefully wraps it up reasonably for BTR. We'll see, some real focus, I think, there on flexibility and clearer segmentation of those target renters. And I think this is probably the year where you're not going to see a huge number of new planning applications or new buildings delivered within BTR at the moment. It is still going to be fairly steady, I think, but we are going to see more growing scrutiny around affordability, and that's something that BTR needs to be kind of mindful of. So, no major strides I don't expect, but it will just be slow and steady for BTR for what I see so far. Now let's hear from our sponsor, Wash Station.
Wash Station proudly sponsor this episode of Housed. We provide best-in-class laundry solutions that complement your buildings. Wash Station. Smart, green, clean.
Wash Station is a leader in managed laundry services. It uses smart technology to deliver reliable, efficient laundry solutions that always put the customers first. With a strong commitment to sustainability and ESG, they help businesses reduce environmental impact without compromising on cleanliness or performance. From intelligent systems to thoughtful services, Wash Station is redefining what communal laundry can be. So if you've got any upcoming projects or your current contract with your legacy providers are coming to an end, please get in contact with John and the team to discuss your requirements. So now on to co-living. Now, co-living for me always feels like it's about to have its moment. And I don't, in similar way to BTR, I don't think we're going to see this massive explosion, but I think it's now shedding the reputation of the past. So I don't think we're going to see a big explosion in co-living in the same way that I don't think we're going to see huge numbers of BTR popping up left, right, and centre. I think that it has shed the experience of the collective, shall we say, where there was probably a bit more of a focus on tech, a little bit like WeWork, a bit of a tech valuation rather than a bricks and mortar real estate valuation. And I think that the collective imploding wasn't good for the sector, but it did really sort of get the word out there about co-living and all the things that could be offered. Now, I think that is where these new players that are coming into co-living, and there are numerous of them, I can't list them all, but I think they've got a serious opportunity because investors are starting to realize that, yes, there is opportunity in co-living. It's not just about being PBSA by the back door. It's very much, trying to set up an industry and a sector in its own right. But I do think this will, again, be a bit of a quiet revolution, I suppose, within co-living this year, with, a few more buildings popping up, some more operators as well. But we have to just make sure that we're offering what those residents want, whether they're young professionals, young families, or, people commuting into work or needing an extra night stay here and there. that mix of short stay and that long-term community, that's absolutely pivotal for co-living to get right. So, Deenie, what do you think is in store for the co-living sector?
I think co-living has a place to deliver what the sector needs. Whether it's going to grasp that and there's going to be a lot of growth this year, I don't know. What I really want to see is the sector really starting to think about its product, its branding, who it's providing for. And because I think it has a real role in solving the housing crisis that we have in this country. I've said this before and I'll continue to say it. Co-living in its European form is something that delivers something dynamic and purposeful. And I'd love to see more of that happening in the UK. And I still don't think we have that in its current form in the UK. And this is what we were talking about at UK Reef when we went to co-living workshops there, is that it's studios, single studios for single people. And I think it's the wrong product for co-living to be in its entirety. And I'm hoping that we start to see change in the sector and start to again, see a change in product diversity from just studios that is co-living.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think based on the fact we are where we are with co-living and what it is, I can't differentiate it to BTR. I don't really know why it's got a different planning structure to it, because it's just managed apartments. They happen to be studios instead of 1, 2 or 3 bed apartments, but it's effectively the same thing. It doesn't have to be the same thing, but I don't necessarily think that's going to change in 2026. There are going through planning. There are some developments that might complete in 2026, but they might fall into 2027. I guess unlike PBSA, there's not an urgency for completions. You'd think the government would be pushing for completion so developers can move on to the next project and create more homes for people. But I think unless there's significant demand for that kind of product at that kind of price in those locations, those developments that are due to complete in 2026 may well slip into 2027. I think it should and could attract a wider demographic than just graduates and young single people. But with the product being what it is, and many of which are single occupancy, that is very hard to do, really. So I'd say my prediction for co-living is going to be we will hopefully see a wider demographic of renters living in co-living, but that would require a change in marketing and a change in product as well.
I agree. But I think it does have an identity crisis still. We will move on in a second, but it is studio-led BTR. Jenna Harris put a poll out a while back saying, what should we call co-living? It is studio-led BTR, but that's not sexy enough. That's not sexy enough for the people that are in co-living to then be saying, hey, we've got something different. It's unique. Let's go and sell this to investors and then to young professionals, etc. But it is the next step on from PBSA. I think that's the really interesting thing that, co-living does have a big opportunity, but how do you then work together and collaborate to make sure that the word is out there very much about co-living? So I do think there's more to come from co-living this year, but it will be steady sort of selective growth rather than, this big explosion. Hopefully they focus very much on that, clarity of purpose and not the branding. Now let's hear from Howden.
Howden is the 5th largest employee-owned business in the UK and one of the largest insurance groups globally. With over 60 years' experience, Howden's specialist education division delivers tailored insurance, risk management and wellbeing solutions for the education sector.
They're the trusted partner of nearly 1,000 schools, colleges, universities and student accommodation providers across the UK.
Howden helps owners and operators protect what matters most, and so they are the perfect sponsors for Housed. Thank you for coming on board for Season 6.
So Howden Insurance are headline sponsors of the British and Irish Lions. So if there are any tickets going spare, do feel free to reach out to us. But really good to have them on board. If there are any insurance needs that you have, do reach out to Howden. That is anything from a contents perspective right the way through the full insurance spectrum. Very grateful to be working with them. So now on to university-owned accommodation. This one does feel quite fragile, but I think there's a massive opportunity here. And especially following the LinkedIn post that I put out over the weekend that I've already talked about, the biggest responses that I got from that was from university halls, the heads of accommodation for various different universities, large and small. And I got about a dozen responses from people saying, we're already trying this. We're having to try things because we want to offer what the students need. It wasn't about because we need to get to full occupancy and hit our revenue targets. I know that is clearly something that they all need to focus on, but it was about we need to be able to offer what the students want. And that is where I think there is such a huge opportunity for university halls to, yes, deal with some quite sort of crippling occupancy challenges as they already have, but then also start to really showcase what innovation looks like within the sector. That is across tech and systems, that is across structure and people and what it takes to actually run a property, and look at the short term and the, potentially looking at longer tenancy lengths as well. There's so much opportunity that they have, I think. So I'm quite excited for what we're going to see from the university sector that will then bleed into PBSA as PBSA keeps getting more and more mature. And I think the occupancy challenges will continue. I think that we're going to have to learn a lot more from university halls. So it's going to be a really interesting one. What do you think, Deenie?
I think we'll start to see universities start to look more closely at accommodation when they've got occupancy issues. They've probably been ignoring it for a number of years where it's just filled and it's done its thing. Whereas when it's not, people are going to start looking at it and seeing how they can fix it. So I think, as we said earlier when we talked about PBSA, I think universities are in a far better position to provide a product that students need and want without always thinking about the revenue side of it. So I think we're likely to see more innovation coming from universities and more testing and trying. That said, we all know universities are struggling financially, so I think they are going to have to also look at outsourcing as part of that innovation. But I think some of those deals are going to be quite difficult in the market we're in to make it work for everyone in that space.
I do predict more outsourcing partnerships and rationalisation. Universities just don't have the capital or risk appetite on a whole that they once did. We know that there's more aging assets as well. And without that kind of cash injection, that accommodation could, compete badly. Historically, while students may get placed in university accommodation, when they've lived there, their satisfaction's not always there if they're living in an aging, property, basically. So there would be an opportunity for universities to kind of outsource that, to PBSA providers, but those agreements have got to be beneficial for both parties. And as Deenie was alluding to there, I think that's going to be really, really tricky, and that's why those partnerships there's been less of them the last few years, because financially they've not worked for both parties, but something's got to give.
I had a good chat with arguably the nicest person in PBSA the other day. I'll let everybody work out who that is, but they're very much in the DBFO, Design Build Fund Operate sector, work very closely with universities. And I have definitely come across as a sort of anti-partnerships, and I am really conscious that they can be so beneficial for universities who need the extra supply, who need the professionalism of, not having everything taken away from them. Universities need to focus on educating students, and a really good partner for these public-private partnerships will definitely help them to focus on what they're good at. And, these partnerships can work incredibly well. We at Resi Consultancy are drafted in when they don't. I think that's one of the key issues that I have, is that I've seen how they can work against a university. And I think, there are some very obvious examples, some of which I can't actually really talk about, but where a university has ended up then being undersold by a private provider that they then that they work with. And I think there is a lot to be said for making sure that these partnerships are right. And it's the contracts in particular, making sure there's flexibility on the rent. You don't want to be having your rent held too high by a private provider, because it will totally affect the number of students that you can actually take on board into your university. That is already bearing out in various different locations. And I think that's where the contracts just need really careful negotiation. That's obvious. But I think that universities need to be very aligned with their private providers to ensure that the cap and collar in terms of the amount that you can increase the rents year on year is realistic, and that it's not going to mean that the university accommodation ends up a lot more expensive than PBSA does, or that they're slower to adapt. So overall, I I think there's a massive opportunity in the private sector working with the universities, as long as it, as you said, Sarah, is mutually beneficial and that you've got a real clear contract. Same with nominations agreements. I don't think they need to be 15, 20 years anymore. So if you're about to sign one of those, I would have a real think about why you're doing that, because there are plenty of universities out there paying a lot of money to PBSA providers. And I know this doesn't make me any friends in some of the bigger providers whereby they're signing these massive nominations agreements. But universities really need to think twice, because PBSA providers, as I said at my Cubo keynote, they would snap your hand off for pretty much anything at the moment in terms of those agreements. So just make sure that you do really focus on negotiating quite hard there. Again, not teaching the university sector to suck eggs, but that's just really giving a bit of a perspective on how important it is for PBSA to have these offerings right now. Whenever people call me about London, developers call me about London, they're typically just asking if I can get them a nominations agreement or any other location as well. And that really sort of sets it up, the fact that planners are looking for it, but also that the PBSA investors are also looking for it. It's really reassuring. So, yeah, I think there are opportunities for university halls. They can be super flexible. They are less beholden to the investors unless they're in a public-private partnerships. Those should be explored. There are some brilliant operators of the DBFO models out there, and there are some brilliant management operators out there that would definitely help a university to focus on what they're good at. So I think there's a real opportunity here for university halls. I would say don't sell the engine to buy petrol. Really consider what your accommodation strategy looks like. Really pleased that there's more universities reaching out than ever to discuss that. So, yeah, lots going on in 2026 for universities, but, we'll also see what happens with the merger that we've already seen with Kent and Greenwich and what that looks like from an application standpoint long term. And then whether that means that, more groups pop up, more universities consolidate, and then does that rationalise the need for their own accommodation when there's so much PBSA in a city? Who knows? So it's going to be an interesting one to see, but that financial pressure is definitely shaping the housing strategy as well. And then lastly, we come on to rented later living, saving the best till last. Now, this sector, I think, has the biggest long-term opportunity, but there are some serious short-term barriers. I think this is about changing hearts and minds for the long term and showing people that they can downsize and how easy that may well be to do, and that rented later living is a definite opportunity for them. So, Sarah and Deenie, I know you guys are very, very focused on this sector. So Sarah and Deenie, I know, having had Honor Barrett from Birchgrove on the podcast a while back now, gosh, that was, right back near the start. That was a real eye-opener for me, but you guys were already aware of the potential in the sector. So Deenie, what are your thoughts on rented later living in 2026?
I think it's a great sector. I think, Dan, as you say, I think it has its role to play in freeing up those family homes for families. My prediction is I don't think we're going to see that much go for incremental growth in later living this year because, like you said, Dan, I think it does need to win hearts and minds, and I think unfortunately, it probably needs some government input or support to help sway people to move out. And I think the government have got too many other things that they're trying to fix and solve right now that I don't think is going to be in their attention. So my prediction is always, I think it absolutely has its place. We absolutely need to see growth in this area, but I think any growth we see is probably going to be incremental and not what we need to really push the balance in the right direction.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more messaging about rented later living. I still think the rented later living for purchasing is getting, all of the attention because it's what's known. When people start thinking about moving, they're thinking about, well, I've got to sell my house and then I'm going to have to buy one and the fees that are associated with that and everything. So I think there's a whole PR need for it, but there just isn't really the evidence there for it. At the moment, just like in PBSA and BTR, rented later living is at the high end at the moment. It's the chandeliers, it's the swimming pools, it's the, private members club type product. And that's great because it gets people's attention and it gets investment into the sector. But we need that to kind of dilute down into, the mainstream rented later living that everybody can live in. And then it will really, really start to change the sector and to create a solution for the housing shortage. But as I said before, single family housing, which we haven't really talked about because it is part of BTR, Well, it is for later living. It's for everyone. It's for students. It's for families. It's for everyone. So everybody can live in professionally managed rented houses, but it's not being marketed as such. Obviously, single family housing is a stupid terminology, but it's a sector led one. Nobody's actually marketing that. But whenever I see like rented community marketing, it is always targeted at families. And yes, families need somewhere to live, but older people need somewhere to live as well. But I did see a planning application local to me that had retirement bungalows on a mixed tenure development. So I think that's probably where I will stick for my predictions for 2026 is it's small incremental changes in the rented later living sector in 2026. But I hope that for 2027, it builds more momentum and, can be a mass market, really.
I agree with you. I think it's going to be marginal gains, but I think rented later living is where PBSA was 20 years ago. So the likes of the Unites and the Opals of the world, who are building fairly mid-range, stock. I think there is going to be some serious maturity, within the next 10 years within rented later living. I think, yes, it's the chandeliers and it's the swimming pools and the members clubs at the moment. But as the concept grows and people start to realize that they can do this, then that's where I think you'll start to see a lot more mid-range players, more affordable players, and not just the chandeliers and members clubs and swimming pools. And I think that's where the government needs to step in. And I think there almost needs to be some kind of PR campaign to talk about, to entice older people out of their homes, to sell them up, to move into rented later living as an opportunity. We're not going to see that from within because, just Birchgrove on their own or any of the other rented later living operators and investors, they're not able to do that just themselves. Even with someone as charismatic and lovely as Honor, I think that's where the government does need to step in to change those hearts and minds for the long term. So, yes, marginal gains, but massive opportunity there. There really is, because, again, the government are not doing, and we haven't really covered the government too much on here, but they're not doing enough to talk about the rented sector at all. And I think that's where we really need to be focusing on bringing those into the targets. Stop just talking about 1.5 million homes and, doing deals with house builders. Like, we have to be embracing BTR, PBSA, co-living, later living, and all the sectors that are housing people, whether they're students or whether they're elderly. So, yes, I think I'd love to see more from the government. I don't think we will at all, because they are still scrabbling around. I think 26 was supposed to be the year of renewal. I can't see it happening. Anyway, I think it's time to wrap up now. We are well over our usual time limit, but if there's one thread running through all of this, it's choice, flexibility and realism. I've copped a lot of flack from agents by criticising some of the brochures that we've seen in the past, selling the dream and not actually delivering. We're starting to see that bear fruit now. There are some investors questioning their returns and what they've originally been sold. And I think there is, and that is across multiple sectors. I think that we really need to make sure that we have positive realism. So we're looking at the challenges and the headwinds, but we're also thinking about the tailwinds as well, and how to leverage those to really deliver better opportunity. So the sectors that really succeed, they'll be the ones that listen the best to the residents, whether they're students or general renters, families, elderly. And the ones that fail, they'll be the ones that assume that yesterday's model will still work tomorrow. That's been, seen in 2025. As always, we'd love to hear whether you agree or disagree. Do join in the conversation on LinkedIn, and we'll revisit these predictions at the end of the year, just as we did last week, to see how brave or foolish we were. Deenie, Sarah and I, we're off to Leeds when the episode is launched. We're looking at our UK Reef venue, meeting the team there and planning our agenda for house the Shared Living Summit. So if you haven't already secured your partnership package and you do want to get involved, then get in touch. There is still time. We're pulling together the agenda in time for the end of January so that can be launched. So do get in touch. Thank you very much, as ever, to My Student Halls for being our headline sponsor for this season once again. Your support is hugely appreciated. And of course, thank you to Utopia and Wash Station for coming on board for season 6. And of course, our newest sponsor, Howden Insurance. Thank you very much. As ever, if you've got any hot topics or ideas of what you want us to cover in season 6 from PBSA, BTR, co-living, later living, HMOs and university accommodation sectors, do get in touch at hello@housepodcast.com. And we will see you next week.